Let me turn to Axel van Trotsenburg. I hope I'm saying it correct. He is both Dutch and Austrian, and he's now the Managing Director of Operations of the World Bank. So, welcome, Axel. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Alicia. When I saw yesterday night Enrique Iglesias, I was reminded of an initiative that he and Jim Wolferson and Michel Camdessus started in the second half of the 90s, namely a dialogue with the Vatican, with the Pontifical Council of Justice and Peace. And the interesting part was that actually it created the search for common values when we are working in development and use a completely different language, while the church is concerned about poverty, but uses also a different language and how you can build bridges. Now, this discussion was not academic, if you wish. I think they had a lot of nice meetings here and so, but actually this translated in a more fundamental debate on debt relief. And at the time, that was the Heavily Indebted Poor Country Debt Initiative. This was an initiative that tried to resolve the debt problem of the poorest countries. And we started that in the mid-90s, but that needed to be enhanced. And there was a whole campaign going on, particularly from the Jubilee 2000, but also the churches got involved. The Catholic Church, we were here a couple of times, the Lambeth Conference of Anglican Bishops, and that in the end yielded enhanced debt relief and ultimately forgiveness on this. But this was a journey that was very important and probably one of the most important things how public opinion, but also church-based groups, had a massive effect actually on the World Bank and the IMF. I cannot actually think of any other one that had such an operational importance. So this type of dialogue, I don't think that we haven't had so systematic, well, also again, with the Catholic Church and other faith-based organizations, but they are important to anchor you. And I think actually in the debate under Wolferson, it turned out that he pushed hard on it was not a slogan, but based on objective of the World Bank when it was said, our dream is a world free of poverty. But it was actually to give a very clear moral compass where the World Bank should go, and it was eventually further developed in setting a goal for extreme poverty as well as shared prosperity. And I think it is actually very important when we listened also to the Pope today that it is not only that the poor cannot wait any longer, but there is also a responsibility by all to act and act now. And I think that when we are looking at this discussion, you see actually a very mixed picture. Because also already Kristalina mentioned that the world has been incredibly successful in reducing extreme poverty. And that we haven't seen in history. And if you look in Asia, and I just remind you for a Nobel Prize winner, Gunnar Myrdal, if you read that book, Asian Drama, you would never have said in the 60s that that continent could develop. Yet it turned it around, and China has basically reduced extreme poverty from 90% in 1980 to 2%. So it has been a spectacular success. Yet there has been also all these failures. And I think we haven't mentioned that today, but it is actually Africa is going to be the biggest challenge on extreme poverty. The population will double by 2050. And if you're now looking at about 700 million extreme poor, the vast majority is living in Africa. And if you then make it a bit more complicated, you see with the fragile states that they are falling even further behind. And our estimates are that the majority of extreme poor will live in fragile countries by 2030. And then in the middle-income countries, we see that even with multilateral support, we have not been able to go beyond diagnostics about inequality, exclusion, lack of jobs, and we have been analyzing that forever in Latin America. We haven't been able to move the needle. And I think we need to keep that in mind when we are looking at solidarity and what it means, because solidarity has a cost, and what would the World Bank do to this? I tend to agree with Jeffrey Sachs that about maybe on the planning side, we need to think longer term. We have completely abandoned that, and in a sense are caught up by short-term ideas, and they may be politically expedient, but are not always yielding the results that we are all aiming at. And I think we are making some efforts, and I think actually the SDGs, with all their strengths and weaknesses, I happen to believe that actually by having a 2030 agenda is an important one, because it helps you to focus. And it helps actually, if you compare that with the MDGs, where nobody international community was behind it, including the multilateral development banks, came much later on this, that the SDGs at least are internalized by it. And for example, in the IDA negotiations, this for the Fund for the Poor, was central to target 2030 and to instill a sense of urgency. Now, what does that mean? That urgency, it means that we need to deliver. And what I say was the cost, it cannot come costless. The World Bank will be in the IDA, we will have now for the next 3 years $82 billion available, but essentially for this decade we will need $300 billion and probably $80–90 billion of grants, because most of these grants will have to go to the fragile states. And this is the big challenge. Is the international community willing to continue to give that money? And I think that is a critical question on this if we want to succeed on this. The second part, for the middle-income countries, I think what helped us in the negotiations for the capital increase, that we actually set targets for 2030, particularly for climate change. That the World Bank has to deliver climate co-benefits in the order of $335 billion through 2030. And that means, and I think that was actually a pretty smart move by our shareholders, is to DNA this institution, because you have to hardwire that whole, the operations on this. And I think this was an extremely important act for this, to put this. But at the same time, when we are looking at all these challenges, it's not only the climate change, it's the poverty, it's the whole sustainability agenda. And I think when we heard today about the debt issue, I think that, what I've seen, having also led the HIPC initiative, we come in waves and we energize and then collectively fail, because there is a lot of indiscipline on the debtors and on the creditors. And what we are seeing is that we have had this discussion with the poor countries, that we basically forgive, particularly the multilaterals, and created space for others to move in. But these are no longer Paris Club creditors or multilateral creditors, they are other creditors, and the picture has become much more complicated. I think if we want to have this, we will need again a new coalition, a broader coalition that also includes all creditors, and no longer the traditional ones which we were talking about 10, 15 years ago. The second thing is we need to also see how we can have that support, what you learn, certainly with the HIPC initiative, you needed broad-based political support. And here, G7 or G20 now. And I think if one doesn't have it, it will be a very difficult uphill battle to succeed on this. Nevertheless, I think that discussion will have to be undertaken, because it is from the poorest countries, there is a risk, again, of unsustainable debt in Africa, and we have to prevent that. And I think we need to act on this. We have taken measures, but it requires cooperation. And I think with the middle-income countries, we all need to see how we can have that dialogue. In the meantime, we need to come back that unfortunately, there are many people that need support. And I think here, with the multilateral organizations, there is the need to fill certainly or accompany the countries with fairly strong social programs to protect the hardest hit from the crisis. And I think there the bank certainly is committed. I think we have, learned also through our own mistakes. But I think when we are now looking in programs together with the fund, we tend to have actually a good discussion on how we can define programs that protect the most vulnerable and that we have to do. So to taking this forward, I think we need to think about this longer term perspective, and I think I would push for that. Secondly, I think it is great to have this discussion with, again, with faith-based institutions, because these are longer systemic issues. And finally, I think we need to keep a very lively debate about multilateral organizations. They have unfortunately been under threat. I think one needs to push back because they are going to be a key in helping resolve international challenges, particularly as it pertains to poverty, climate change, and fragility. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and also for bringing in the notion of the middle-income countries. I think for this region, we are basically a middle-income region, and we need breathing space, because some multilaterals, like the World Bank, are graduating our countries, and I don't know what graduation means. It's like you end up outside of a cliff, and we need space, breathing space, to make that transition happening, and I think it's very important to have the lessons learned, as you said, from the HIPIC experience that this region also went through in a very painful way. So very, very good. Thank you, Axel. Let me